Welcome, everybody. We'll start in just a minute, as I see people are still joining. Okay, let's just start and hopefully some more people will join as we go. Thank you all for being here. This is the third session of a series I'm organizing to develop methods for a research project on social change and inertia in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The series is funded by the British Academy with support from the University of Greenwich's Institute for Life Course Development's Center for Inequalities. I won't talk much more about my work today. I plan on letting us all learn from our speakers over the coming months, and then we'll present my thoughts on the series and my plans to integrate and use these methods to you all as the concluding session of the series early next year. Before we begin, I'd like us to take a moment's silence in solidarity with all peoples continuing to suffer genocide and ecocide across the globe, and all the other crises we're attempting to understand and address with our work. Thank you. The first of our speakers today is Ismael Puga, a professor at the Economy and Society Research Center at the Universidad Central de Chile. His research explores ideological and legitimation processes, collective action, and anomie in contemporary societies. We also welcome Dr. Chris Moya, a research associate in the socioeconomic panel at the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. His research focuses on social inequalities, redistributive justice, and discrimination in labor markets. Thank you so much, Ismael and Chris, for volunteering your time to tell us about your work. And I thank every speaker who has offered their time and effort to this series in general. The session will be divided into 4 sections. We begin with an introduction to ideological inversion theory and implications. Next, our speakers will discuss measurement of ideological inversion and its effects through survey data. The third section will focus on considerations to take into account when engaging in comparison across contexts or time. Finally, the last section will focus on assessing ideological inversion through unstructured or text data. Please type your questions in the Q&A, or if you're using an older browser, in the chat throughout the session. I'll convey your questions to the speakers at the end of each section. At the end of the session, we'll also have time for further questions, and you can go on screen. Just raise your hand to ask, and I'll bring you on screen if you like. Today's session has automated captioning in multiple languages if you're more comfortable in a language other than English. Just turn on captions and change the language setting on the top right of the captions bar to your preferred language if available. The session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube and our archives, and I'll provide the links at the end. So without further ado, I will bring you Ismael on the screen and take it away. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Fouad. I'm very excited to be here, and really thank you for this invitation. We have prepared a presentation about our research and our further agenda regarding ideological inversion, and we have tried to focus on the methodological issues that we face when trying to apply this concept regarding basically how is it possible to explain social stability or social conformism uh, when or if social structures, social relations of domination are actually not legitimated individually by persons, by people. Now, the basic hypothesis of ideological inversion is that it is not about psychological motives of individuals to believe that social structures are fair, but there is actually an intersubjective process by which people end up thinking that most of the others uh, legitimate the status quo. So, as Fouad explained, we have an outline with 4 points now, and the first one is about theory and implications. The second is about measuring with survey data. The second is about comparison across time and space and how this helps us sort some difficulties. And finally, we want to expand on possible innovations regarding unstructured data and social media data to measure ideological inversion. The sections will not be of the same length, I expect, so bear with me as we advance first with the concepts. Yeah. So the first section is titled Legitimation Mechanisms and the Theory of Ideological Inversion Mechanism. And it starts by saying, okay, that this is a concept that we developed in the search for an explanation for what's been called the neoliberal resilience or the undeath of neoliberalism. So this idea that a social order like neoliberal societies, for example, can suffer from widespread uh, illegitimacy in the sense that most people have strong grievances against it, and yet it doesn't enter a crisis. Yeah, it doesn't change. We don't see social change as often as we could expect of a system that fails to muster enough social support when we study actual preferences of people around the globe. So, um, checking on this, if we go to classical social theory, we will find that there are two great concepts that can help explain the stability of a social order. The first and the most classic in a way, it's the idea of legitimation or legitimacy. So it's this idea that people do not engage in social change action because they believe the system is socially legitimated. So they believe that in their society, the social order enjoys a certain degree of consensus regarding its justness or its fairness, etc. Mhm. Uh, but on the other hand, research about neoliberalism has often found that perhaps anomy, another classical concept of social theory, could be a better explanation or a complementary explanation for stability in the sense that in a society where people cannot trust each other, in a society where there is very low social cohesion, even if people do not believe in the legitimacy of the social order, it might be really hard to organize, to coordinate the collective action necessary for effecting social change. So the concept of ideological inversion as a mechanism is an attempt to merge these two ideas into one single explanatory mechanism. So these two general ideas will be our explanation of the absence of transformative collective action. That's the puzzle we have set for us. A first notion that we need to establish is the distinction between social legitimacy itself and the idea of social validity. Uh-huh. In classical social theories, such as Weber's, for example, it's important to understand that in most times, in normal times, yeah, in everyday situations, legitimation is not the explanation for conformist behavior. The main explanation for conformist behavior is actually what Weber calls a constellation of interests. This means that in most everyday situations, individuals, as individuals, not as groups, find in their own interest to just behave in a conformist way. So the workers do not go on strike because they might lose their jobs, or if they feel that if their company has a bad time, they will suffer in their salaries, etc. A system where there is no balance, there is no constellation of interest that finds a balance in everyday situations will not endure. So in a way, legitimation is not a constant mechanism explaining stability, but it is a mechanism for when these constellations of interest fail. So the point of this is that we should not expect any motivation mechanism, any social legitimation mechanism to explain everyday behavior, everyday conformist behavior. We should rather search for economic explanations of everyday behavior and instead look for legitimation explanations of conformist behavior in these critical moments where the constellations of interest break. So when there is an economic crisis, when there is a political opportunity moment, etc. In these moments where individuals can glimpse at an alternative of social change, then legitimation might explain why this moment, why this event does not realize. The second point we need to understand is that legitimation in classical social theory is not about value-oriented behavior. It's not that individuals act in a conformist way because they believe the social order is legitimate. That for classical social theories will be a very unstable mechanism in the sense that the beliefs of people, the values of people change all the time. So they are quite plastic. They over time and over crisis, and as their personal interests change, the prevalent ideas in any society will change a lot. So any system, any society that will be dependent on the beliefs of the people, of the majority of the people every single day, will be rather unstable. So the idea of legitimation as a stabilizing mechanism is not about the ideas of the individual, but about the ideas that the individual knows the collective holds commonly. So legitimation works not through my beliefs, but through the beliefs of the others. I recognize the validity of the social order because I recognize that the others validate it, and that is way more stable than my own beliefs. So the point is not to explain whether my ideas affect my behavior, but whether my perception of the others' ideas explain my behavior. And this is a very important point because we do not have direct access to the ideas of the others. There are different sources, different mechanisms which could explain how I perceive these ideas, these dominant ideas in society, and therefore this open theoretical space for different mechanisms of legitimation. We distinguish, given this umbrella idea, between three main different social legitimation mechanisms. The first and most classic is the idea of social legitimacy, in which basically the social order is able to foster enough beliefs about its own justness, its own fairness. So basically, most of the people judge the social order as fair, and therefore, naturally, most of the people perceive that the collective legitimates the social order. So there is not much conflict here. Only a minority of the people finds the social order unjust, and therefore all the people, even those that consider it unjust, feel pressure to behave in a conformist way. The second mechanism, we can trace it to ideas like Bourdieu's, for example, is the idea of dissimulation. So here the point is, okay, maybe a lot of people has a conflict between their own values and the actual functioning of the social order and the actual functioning of social relations. But the actual functioning of the social relations is somewhat obscure. It's opaque. People cannot perceive it perfectly. So it's not that it's totally concealed, but they perceive it in a way in which it is not totally in conflict with the ideas that they believe most of the society holds. So, for instance, if most people in a society consider that inheritance, capital inheritance or exploitation is unfair, mhm, but at the same time, most people perceive that capitalist society is mostly meritocratic and there is not so much inheritance or there is no much exploitation, then the conflict between these ideas perceived as dominant and the actual function of society is not perceived as blatant. And therefore, a certain regard of conformist behavior will continue. The idea of ideological inversion is not based on the simulation. It's not based on the idea that social structures are opaque. On the contrary, it's based on the idea that people most of the time can perceive very clearly the conflict between their own preferences, the conflict between their own interests, and the function of capitalism or any other society. So there is no obscuring of the conflict between my preferences and values and society, but the problem is, how do I perceive the ideas of the others? How do I perceive how valid, how socially valid is the social order? On the other hand, we have the problem of anomy and the relation between anomy and shared norms. Without social norms, I don't have the ability to depend on others, and therefore anomy also works through the beliefs of the others. In a way, when we open the idea that, okay, the perception of the other's values can have different sources, just as we identify different sources of legitimation, we might identify different sources of anomy. And this will all come together at some point. The idea of ideological inversion came from qualitative research initially in Chile, um, where we were trying to identify, okay, this was in the 2000s, and we were trying to find out why there wasn't any collective action in Chile's neoliberalism. And what we found there, uh, this is the coding of many conversations in discussion groups with people from different social classes. And what we map there are different actors, different social actors, and the descriptors that people use to describe them. So you will see there are 4 clusters, and on the bottom right, you will find the rich people. And the rich people are perceived as abusive, as favored, as powerful, as exploitative. On the bottom left side, you will find the working class and the middle class, the lower middle class, and the youth, and they are perceived as hardworking, exploited, discriminated, deprived, etc. So far, a very class warfare perception, if you want. No? So it's a perception of actors clearly confronted with each other. At the middle, there are the politicians, which are perceived as ambitious, talented, but lazy, discriminating, selfish, etc. And there is this 4th cluster, marked in red. And this cluster is interesting because this is just the people, the Chilean people, the people in general, everyone, etc. And they are conformist, they are scared, they are obedient, they are asleep, they are powerless. So all the classes have interests, all the classes are conscious of their own interests. There is this class warfare perspective on the perception of each specific group, but people in general is conformist. And this conflict is strange, no? So from this came the following idea. If we take classic Marxist concepts of ideology, we will find the following. In a materialist model, there are structural relations, and people enter into these relations like a salary relation, like patriarchal relation or domestic labor, which are not truly voluntary. They are largely They, they are largely mandatory for people because they exist regardless of our choice. We cannot decide to exist outside of capitalism, for example. Uh, So we are economically constrained to exist within these relationships. That's why they are structural. Otherwise, they wouldn't be structural. Mhm. So the first point is that in any society, material relations of power and a change shape a great deal of our everyday practices. On the other hand, in ideology, will say Marx, material relations and practices appear as if resulting from ideas. And this is a very specific thing about capitalism. So ideology is the inversion of the relation between ideas and material reality. It's not about not perceiving reality as it is. It is about perceiving reality, material reality, as the result of ideas. That's the problem. So if we make this peak with the theory of legitimation in classical sociology, we will find the following. The belief in social legitimacy is the belief that the others legitimate the order. But we have no direct access to the other's belief. We must infer the content of the other's preferences. In a way, concrete actions, the practices of people, speak louder than words. You can say that you are socialist, an anarchist, an anti-imperialist, but if you go every day to work in a solid relation, I will infer that in practice, you actually behave in a conformist way. You legitimate the order. Mhm. So therefore, people infer much more conformist values from these practices, from this everyday practice of everyone else in everyday situation. So in other ways, it's not that capitalism is able to produce shared ideas about its justness, but it's capable of producing the perception of shared ideas of injustice. If we use the language of game theory for this, the problem is the following. The problem is that people might have a shared knowledge or a shared belief that a system or a social structure is unjust, but they don't have a common knowledge of this. They don't have a common belief. Most people might find a social structure unjust or intolerable even, but they don't know that most of the others also believe that. Mhm. This means, on the other hand, that the more constrained social action is, the harder the social structure press on everyday behavior, the louder this ideological effect will be. In other words, the more the markets colonize the life world, the more the market is in the pension systems, the less there is welfare systems, the more the market is on inserted in our, I don't know, caretaking logics or healthcare system, etc., the stronger this fantasy of a consensus will be. So this will mean that, for example, in neoliberal societies where the market has colonized most of the life world, this bias, this ideological bias will be even stronger. More people will feel the pressure, the need, or will develop the feelings that the system is unjust. But the more people will be forced to act in more ways, uh, in ways that look conformist to the others. And therefore, this gap between the actual ideas of the people and the perceived ideas of the people will widen. So from this very general notion that the problem with capitalism and with social domination in general is that it produces practices that make each of us infer the legitimacy of themselves without actually producing this legitimacy, we will obtain five main hypotheses. The first is that through the inversion of the relation between material relations and ideas, people systematically overestimate the support for the status quo among others. This is what we call the ideological bias. The aggregation of this is what we call a fantasy consensus or a consensus of fantasy. People live under the fantasy of a consensus which actually doesn't exist. The second hypothesis is that this happens due to constrained practices, and therefore, the more the market dominates social life, the stronger the ideological bias across societies. Third, if the others believe, then I must accept that the order is socially legitimate. And therefore, the stronger the ideological bias, the less likely is mobilization towards social change. The fourth is that if the others believe, they cannot be trusted. Because most people actually don't believe the system is just, because actually most people find their societies unjust. If they believe that the others find it just, then they have a strong value conflict with most of their society. Therefore, the stronger the ideological bias, the stronger the perception of enemy. And finally, because material practice speaks louder than words, only action can communicate dissent as effectively as ideology communicates conformism. Therefore, we expect that events of disruptive collective action might deter ideological bias over time. So basically, just as in Marx's classic text, to fight ideology, you cannot fight it with phrases. It can only be dismantled with collective material practice. Now, if we understand legitimation processes in these ways, it presents a series of methodological problems for classical social sciences methods. Most of social sciences methods are designed to measure individual ideas. Even qualitative research mostly works with individual meaning or individual communications, etc. We have very little tools, especially built to understand the perceptions of the ideas of others. So we have the problem of measuring the ideas of others. And on top of that, we need to measure the bias about the ideas of others. So I need to understand how each individual perceives the ideas of others and how biased is that perception. Then there are other problems which are more common to different explanatory mechanisms for macro-social problems, which have to do with endogeneity. It might be that ideological bias, so the perception that the others are conformists, more conformist than they actually are, leads to mobilization. But it also might lead to the absence of mobilization. But it might also happen that the more I mobilize, the more I am exposed to people with values similar to mine, the less bias I develop. So there is an endogenic problem there. And finally, this is not a problem, but rather an horizon if you want, because ideology works on the macro level, it's not an individual problem, but an intersubjective problem. Most of its explanatory power will not be between individuals, but it will be between different social contexts across time and across societies. So it is also an explanatory model that will require to assess its full explanatory capacity to collect data on a comparative level. So that will be, I think, the first section. I don't know, Fouad, if you have recorded some questions regarding this first part already.
Uh, we don't have any questions so far.
Mhm.
Would anybody like to ask a question now before we continue to the second section? Just type it into the chat, please.
We can keep going with the second
We can
section
keep
for
going.
now. Yeah,
Mhm.
let's go to the second part. So, uh, it came to the beginning anyway. Okay. So we have these methodological problems, and one of the solutions we found had to do with factorial survey experiments and an instrument that we designed to measure ideological bias. I will try to explain how this works as clearly as possible. We made two experiments. The first was in Chile, 2018, just before the social revolt that in 2019, well, basically shackled the perceived stability of Chilean neoliberalism. So Chile was famous for being one of the most stable countries in Latin America, and very suddenly we had this huge social uprising where the legitimation of the economic system in Chile came clearly under question. And then another experiment in Chile 2022. This was after the revolt resulted in an attempt for a constitutional change, which failed utterly, which was in a way a very devastating event for the progressive forces and in general for activists for social change. So we have a sort of perfect moment for testing this hypothesis in 2018, like everyone perceived the other to be legitimate, but actually a social revolt was simmering beneath the surface. While on the other hand, we have the most stringent context for testing an hypothesis like this, a situation where actually people had moved towards more conservative preferences after the social mobilization, and there was no social mobilization at all. So it was really difficult to predict social action, social collective action. The experiments are surveys applied in 4 major cities in Chile: Santiago, Antofagasta, Temuco, and Valparaiso. Valparaiso only in the second experiment. And it's a probabilistic survey each, face-to-face, made with computer assistant interviews. And well, the sample size are quite reasonable for an experiment of this type. So the basic idea is that in each experiment, an interviewee is an ego. We call them an ego. It's a person. And each of these persons is presented with 8 different vignettes. Each of these vignettes represents another person, which we call an alter. So we're always talking about the relationship, the ideological relationship between ego and alter. So we first measure ego's ideas, and this is not a psychometric construct. It's important to say. This is a very historically concrete conflict in Chile regarding, okay, a desire for stronger social order and stronger authorities, an authoritarian side on one side, and the growing pressure for social change, more participation, more democratization in the end. We measure several dimensions, but this is what we call the political dimension, and it will be the central part of our explanation, the exposition today. So we basically make people locate themselves in this spectrum, either closer to one pole or to the other, or in the middle if they prefer. So we have an 11 points in total spectrum. It's a double barrel scale if you want, but it is important for us to capture a complex spectrum of political positions, of social positions within quickly, yeah, because we will measure this many, many times in each interview. Then we will measure alters ideas. So each interviewee will be shown 8 vignettes like this one. This is an example. So it says, okay, Andrea is 27 years old. She works as a teacher. Financially, she's doing well. Her father has a university degree, and so on and so on. So we have some information regarding her social position, her demographics, where does she live, and how she voted, a social practice, a political practice, and where do her children go to school? A public school, a charter school, a private school. So these practices that are actually mostly driven by economic constraints and intent and interest, given certain social structure, but that we expect will actually make people infer ideas regarding Andrea. So these demographics, these social positions, and these practices, despite being largely constrained by economic decisions, will be used by our interviews to infer the content of Andrea's ideas. And they will position Andrea in the same scale where they positioned themselves before. And they will do this for 8 different vignettes each. This is the map of the different categories that we use to construct the different vignettes. So we had 8 different occupations, from housework to a receptionist in a medical center, to a policeman, to a high school teacher, to an owner of a mid-sized firm. We had people who voted for different sectors. We have different school choices for their children. We have people without children, etc., etc., etc. So all the combinations of all these categories are possible in our vignettes. And together, all these combinations, all these combinatories, define a theoretical population of alter. We have this imagined population of all the types of vignettes that you could create with these categories. Now, the idea in this experiment in particular is that this population mimics in diversity, of course, not in distribution, but in diversity and the range, the population of ego. So basically, our sample of individuals, of interviewees, is restricted to the people who can be represented in these vignettes. However, the population of alter has 2 different characteristics, which are very distinct from the population of interviewees. First, it is balanced between categories. So we have as many firm owners as we have receptionists. And we have as many people with 20-something years old and people with 50-something years old, which doesn't happen in the actual population. And on the other hand, the categories, the factors defining the categories are orthogonal in the population of authors. So each category is uncorrelated with the categories in other factors. We use, as in any factorial survey experiment, we will use an optimizing algorithm to select a balanced sample of the population of alters. So we had this immense number of possible vignettes, and we selected 256. This sample of vignettes keeps the balance and orthogonality. So we select them in a way that every category has the same share of vignettes in the sample, and no category is correlated with other. And then we take this sample and we divide it in 32 decks of 8 alter. We need to divide it in different decks because we cannot show a person 256 vignettes, of course. We can only show them 8 at most. That's what we went for. So we try to balance as well the categories, the different categories within each deck. This is totally possible. And because of this, there is no correlation between each category and each interviewee. So there is no person that actually saw only firm owners. There is no person that saw more women than men in the vignettes, for instance. So on average, so to say, each interviewee was exposed to the same extent to each of the categories. Now, it's very important to remember that the population of alter and the population of ego are mirrored. So each alter is described with certain categories, and we measure the same factors and categories for each ego. On the other hand, each ego chooses a position in this political order or change scale, and then each alter is attributed with a position in the same scale by ego. Therefore, and there comes the process of, of calculating ideological bias, we can first model a regression to obtain ego's expected ideas. So we take a series of characteristics of ego, E1, E2, E3, etc., and we model the ideas of ego. This is done with a simple, robust linear regression model, and this results in an equation. So the ideas that I would expect on average for a person can be expressed in this regression model. Then I can do the same with alter, with the ideas that are attributed to each alter by the sample. Of course, these ideas are attributed by the egos. They are not their own, so we call them alter socially attributed ideas. And they are a function of a series of characteristics of the alter, which are written in the vignette. So alters attributed ideas are a function of A1, A2, A3, etc. Because there are many alters in each survey, these are MLE fixed effect models with observed information matrix estimation. Now, the point is that if I have ego's expected ideas and I have the function that creates it, and I have altered socially attributed ideas, I have a different function for them, I can change the function and the data used to solve it. So what we will do is to take the function defining how people attribute ideas to alter, and we will solve it, but for the characteristics of the actual interviewees. So in this way, we will calculate which ideas our whole sample will have attributed to each one of our interviewees. So if all the other interviewees were about to attribute ideas to you, we will obtain on average this score that we call ego socially attributed ideas. This allows us to map the relation, the distance, the gap between, for each person, their expected ideas, the ideas that people in the sample would have attributed to them on average, if there wasn't an ideological bias, if people tended to perceive more or less okay how each other thinks, versus the ideas that actually are attributed to each one. And what we found is this. So in the vertical axis, you have the expected ideas of each interviewee. So higher values indicate a preference for social change. And in the horizontal axis, you will find the ideas that people will attribute to each of these persons. And values to the right indicate that they will attribute them a higher preference for change. The red line is where the cases will distribute themselves if people more or less on average would guess right how the others think. And of course, we don't expect that to happen. Of course, there can be a lot of variation in perceptions. But the point is that, as you can see, systematically, everyone is perceived to be way more conservative than they are. So actually, and you can see that because the lines are quite parallel, people understand very well the difference, the ideological difference between different persons. People understand the difference between a rich white man and a poor, brown woman. But to both of them, they attribute more conservative ideas that they have. So there is this gap, this this constant that people add of conservatism to everyone more or less in the same extent. So basically, what we found was evidence for this hypothesis that people systematically overestimate the support for the status quo among others. This is what we call the ideological bias. Now, the problem is how do we relate this bias with actual behavior? So we reverse the previous exercise. We take the function for ego's expected ideas. So actually the way in which the characteristics of the people make people think, and we solve it, but for the characteristics of our vignettes, for the categories of our vignettes. So we obtain the score, the ideas that if people had perfect perception of each other, they would have attributed to each vignette. And then we compare these ideas, these expected ideas of each vignette, with the ideas that each interviewee actually attributed to the vignette. And if we calculate the ratio between this, and then we can calculate the natural logarithm of this to normalize a score, we will have a measure of how much a person tends to overestimate the support for the status quo or underestimate the support for the status quo. Some of you who might be familiar with the use of Jasso's formula, for example, for the ratio for the fairness of justice evaluations, you will find that the scale is similar. So in this scale, values below 0 indicate that people overestimate the support for the status quo, and values above 0 indicate people who underestimate the support for the status quo. And we measure here different dimensions. Blue line is politics, but we also measure about economics, about family models, about education systems. And you will find that people always overestimate the status quo in the great majority. But most importantly, we have variation in this perception between persons, so we can test the effect of this on their behavior. And what we found there, when we try to predict collective action, participation in concrete political collective actions, we found that the ideological bias on the political dimension is the single most important predictor of collective action participation. It is actually more important than your own ideas. So it's more important how do you perceive that the others think, that your own beliefs, your own judgments of justice regarding the social order. So we found, again, evidence for this idea that the stronger the ideological bias, the less likely is mobilization towards social change. And this is very preliminary, we haven't published this. We also found that the stronger the ideological bias, the stronger the perception of enemy in different dimensions. So both of these hypotheses worked well. In the 2022 experiment, we had this totally different context, so we wanted to test whether this theory works even in this very stringent situation. Of course, the experiments cannot be completely equivalent because we weren't just coming out of a normal presidential election, but we actually had a constitutional process. So the type of election where our vignettes voted was necessarily very different. And the meaning of that was necessarily different. And this is important to remark because it is a problem for comparison with this method. So if I wanted then to compare the vignettes in an experiment made in Chile with another made in France or in Argentina or anywhere else, actually I would have to compare models created with very different political systems, and that might the comparison between them making up a calibrated system of vignettes for both for different contexts might be quite difficult. So that's a challenge. So as we couldn't create a perfectly equal experiment, we took the space for some innovations and improvements. So we created a better class model for our vignettes, uh, following a recalling rights adaptation to Latin American context by Person Mother, and we created a factorial design where we totally separated class positions from occupational status. And we also included cues on the ethnicity of each of the vignettes through the names of them. What we found in this totally different context is this. So we still observe the very systematic ideological bias. People still always think that the others are more conservative than they are. But you will see that there is way more variation. There is way more uncertainty. So this means that after the failure of the constitutional process, after the huge mobilization and blah, 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 what happens is that people don't really know how, how the others think. They tend to think they are way more conservative than they are, but also they don't know. And people tend to attribute widely different ideas to each other. So still people systematically overestimate the support of the status quo, but on top of that, there is a lot of uncertainty about how the others think. Regarding the other results, what we found is that this bias still predicts collective action with one important exception, which is the Mapuche movement, one of the Chilean native peoples movement, where the contrary happens. And this has a lot of interesting theoretical implications, but we don't have the time to discuss right now. And we also found that the ideological bias predicts anomie again. And then we have this change between stable bias, like this constant bias on top of each one, to this very uncertain bias where different people attribute more conservative ideas to different persons. Regarding our hypothesis, however, there are two which this model cannot solve. The first has to do with the more the market dominates social life, the stronger the ideological bias across society. We will need comparisons for this. And we also cannot check this idea that collective action itself might deter ideological bias over time. We will need, longitudinal data for this, which is the third section that we want to check.
Okay, we have an opportunity for some more questions. Yes, we have one. Okay. Were there differences in how much egos overestimate depending on the characteristics of alter? So, for example, when alter is those who are more higher class jobs, men, then are egos more likely to overestimate that?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. We had the contrary hypothesis. We had the idea, I mean, of course, most people will tend to think that, for example, richer people or whiter people will be more conservative than the oppressed people. They think that because it's true. That's the first point. So that doesn't mean that they will overestimate it more, you know? So we actually predicted that the contrary will happen. We predicted that the more oppressed a person, the more people will overestimate how conservative they are because they are more constrained in their practice. So they can act their own preferences the less. So there is more gap between their actual interest and the interest that they can show through their practice. We have found some evidence on this, but it's not completely consistent. That's the truth. We're still exploring that. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions for now, or shall we continue with the third section? Looks like
Go
we can
on.
continue. Yep.
Okay. Uh, so Panel data and the role of comparison, and the lack of comparison so far. I have to start with that. So we have a need for comparison with a model like this. Ultimately, ideology, as we were talking, it's an aggregated effect. So we we take these variations on ideological bias. We know them. There is always some individual variation, but in the end, we believe this effect is actually a structural effect. No, it's not that each individual specifically is affected by ideology, but it's also this overarching effect, in which I perceive that everyone acts in a conformist way, and therefore I must infer that people must be conformist in general. Mhm. So we would actually expect ideology to be especially relevant to understand differences between societies or between different historical contexts. Because it depends on the constraints on everyday practices, ideological bias should be stronger where the structures and institutions constrain more heavily the decisions and practices of individuals. Yeah. So we would expect, if we were able to make a comparison for this, for example, that in welfare states, the gap between actually shared ideas and the perceived ideas as dominant will be less than in, for example, ultraliberalized capitalisms. Mhm. But then comparison is also important because, well, more than comparison, because we need to check whether this works at all in different contexts. Does this ideological inversion mechanism work in other varieties of capitalism? Or does it work in rich societies, much richer than Chilean society, for example? Mhm. The problem is that comparison presents a lot of challenges for this sort of model. First, we will need unified scales. As I explained to you, this is not a psychometric scale. It doesn't measure um, a concept that we can apply without a context. And it is harder to find a stable psychometric context concept that you can measure in a single item. And you have to measure these items a lot of times. So we cannot use the classic Likert scale, for example. Mhm. Then there is the problem of creating factual experiments for different contexts, which actually can be compared. Mhm. So we need, for example, to come up with a design where we can classify the voting behavior of a German voter and, a Sri Lankan citizen and, a Chilean citizen, And of course, the very political systems are different and the political spectrums are different and the political actors are different. So this involves quite a challenge and it probably limits the extent to which you can make comparisons. Maybe you will need to to strip off some of the factors, some of the categories from the vignettes. Mhm. Even social groups, social classes might have different meanings. Occupations might have different meanings in different societies, etc. Mhm. And of course, there is the problem that you know survey experiments are quite expensive, and so a comparison requires, of course, an association with more researchers interested in doing something like this. So if you are interested in doing something like that in another country, we will be very, very interested in hearing about that. But then there is another sort of comparison which is across time. And this has to do with the problem of endogeneity we were talking before. There is an alternative explanation for our findings regarding the relationship between ideological bias and collective action. And this alternative explanation is that maybe the experience of collective action, maybe every time I go to a demo, this leads me to a perception of collective efficacy and cohesion. So therefore, a lower ideological bias. So the more I get involved with activists and with people who mobilize, then the less I perceive the others as conservative. That will make total sense, and there is actually abundant literature in social movements about this. So we have a potential endogeneity problem, and The first option will be to use instrumental variables. We haven't come up with any very good so far, and it's not as solid as I would like for testing something like this. So we went for a longitudinal panel data experiment. So we started with this panel data, and this opened other options besides controlling this endogeneity, but also opens other difficulties. There are further uses. For example, we using panel data, we can check whether the ideas I perceive in the others change in time how I think, for example. So this classic idea that if I perceive certain dominant ideas in my society, then I will tend to think like these dominant ideas in time? Or is the other way around? Is it that my own ideas tend to drive how I perceive the dominant ideas in my society? So I have this sort of confirmation bias in which I tend to think that the others think like me. Both could be. Or we can also use panel data to check this other hypothesis about the impact of political events and specifically about collective action events. If we have variation of the bias in time, we can check whether events of institutional politics, like elections, policy change, etc., affect ideological bias, or whether collective actions events, which of course we cannot, we cannot make them happen, we cannot know when they will happen completely, might have an effect on our panel data. However, there is a huge difficulty here, which is that attrition, which is a part of any panel data, and factual experiments do not mix very well. When you make a panel data, you are basically interviewing the same people once and again. So you are not looking for change between different samples, but you are looking for change in each individual. The problem is that most of the people actually drop off from your study between the first wave and the second wave and the third wave. And this is bad enough in a normal panel data design, but when you need your vignettes to be balanced and orthogonal for the experiment to work, attrition will not respect that. So if you started with 12 different decks and the first deck has an attrition of 50% and the fourth deck has an attrition of 80%, you're in serious trouble. So you won't be able to keep the balance of the factual experiment in time. Therefore, we had to drop this idea completely. And this means that we cannot at the same time measure variation in time of the ideas perceived of the others and contrast it with the actual ideas of the others, with the actual expected ideas of the others. So we cannot measure the bias against a standard, but we can measure the change in time of how conservative or progressive the ideas of the others are perceived. So basically, we cannot say with panel data there is bias, but we can say, okay, we don't know if this is a bias, but there is more bias now than before, or there is less. No? And then finally, it is much harder, of course, to secure external validity. Because panels are expensive and because there is a lot of attrition. So we will drop totally in this case, the pretense of external validity. We will use a non-probabilistic sample, and we will focus in change within each case, within case effects. On the other hand, because we have given up on external validity and probabilistic samples, we can take the chance with this sort of instruments to do comparative analysis, using, for example, online service, which the cost does not go up so widely by testing different countries, for instance. So in this different design, we created a pseudo experiment in which each case is presented with the same 6 vignettes. So there is no factual design. Each person sees exactly the same vignettes, and therefore I cannot calculate the expected ideas of each vignette, and therefore I cannot calculate the bias. But I know, because every person sees the same vignettes each way, I know whether this person now thinks that the first vignette is more conservative than before or less conservative than before. We measure quite often. We make a wave, a new measurement each 2 months. We started in September 2024. We are in the 5th wave right now, so this is very, very preliminary. We are expecting to have 9 vignettes, I think, but 9 waves. And we had been hoping for some collective action events, but no luck so far. So we haven't been able to check whether any massive protests have an effect on this, because there have been no massive protests. And it's based on an online non-probabilistic survey with a rolling design, which means that it's very difficult to prevent attrition over time. So we do not try to, especially in 9 waves, we do not try to measure the same person 9 times, but we refresh the sample with each wave. So we try to keep a good number of people on each wave that has responded at least 2 or 3 times before. So it's a rolling pattern, because all what matters to us in this case is the within case comparison. The simplified vignettes are much simpler as well in the sense of information. They have much less categories. Also, we cannot vary them too much, because we don't have space we don't have degrees of freedom to represent too many differences with only 6 vignettes. So it's mostly about gender, age, and class. It's always the same. They are very short, so people can understand them quite quickly. And this will be the brief version, no? So the first vignette is female, works in domestic labor, has 37. The second one is male, skilled manual, self-employed, has an assistant, 39, etc., etc., etc. As you can see, we make the age vary very little. We are basically dropping the age, but we put an age so people can imagine the people more clearly. But we try to have a good range of different class positions. We didn't think of this first, but then once we came up with this design with the same vignettes for each case, we actually realized it has some advantages. Because all the interviews see the same alter. For example, we can run factor analysis on them. So we can see how each vignettes relate with each other. And we can answer questions like, is there a simple factor representing the perceived legitimacy of the status quo? Or is there, for instance, another factor representing a class conflict perception? Is there a factor that makes people perceive, the firm owners as conservative and the working class people as less conservative, for instance, or on the contrary? There is also, because all the interviewees see the same alter, we can compare each vignette's relevance. So we can use the evaluation, the ideas attributed to each vignette as a different variable, and we can check, for example, which vignette is more important to predict the behavior of our interviewees, or which vignette contributes the most to the factor analysis solution. So which vignette is more important for the overall perception of the legitimacy of the status quo. These are the preliminary results. As I was telling you, this is only with the first 4 waves of our study, and we run a very simple principal component analysis. This is including all the cases, not necessarily only the ones that have kept participating in different waves. And what we found is mostly that there is a single factor solution. So there is this overarching perceived legitimacy across the different boundaries of class. Mhm. The second factor has an eigenvalue of less than 1, which means that it it basically matters less than a single vignette in a way, but it actually behaves like a class conflict factor. So it is way less important than the overarching perception of legitimacy, but there is this class conflict factor as the second factor, in which basically the third and the fifth um, vignettes are completely reverse against the others. And this is the prestigious engineer and the firm owner. So these people are perceived more conservative as the others are perceived as more progressive. Mhm. So people with a strong score in the second factor tend to perceive society as divided by classes in terms of ideas. Then we try this preliminary analysis of how different alter attributed ideas predict the ideas of ego. So if in wave one, I have these ideas I attribute to different vignettes, how this affects how I think the next wave. So whose opinion is most important to define how I think that I should think. Mhm. It's important to say that all the vignettes have a strong effect on my own ideas on the next measurement if I test them for them on its own. But if I put them all together in a single model, what happens is that the prestigious engineer, which happens to be female in this design, is the most relevant. So this is the social actor, so to say, social group that seems to be most important for defining the ideas of the people in the future. It is important to say that I tend to think this is more related to the class than to the gender because we have three different vignettes which are female and only this one becomes more relevant than the other vignettes. Huh? And then finally, the most important finding of this experiment so far is that we were able to check the effect of the ideas perceived on others, which we obtained with this PCA analysis. We captured this single factor solution. And we use then the ideas attributed to others in one wave to predict the collective behavior in the next wave. Mhm. So we control endogeneity because people were perceiving the ideas of others before, before engaging in collective action. It cannot be the other way around. And what we found is extremely interesting. We find that my own ideas, this has all the demographic controls and blah, 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 of course, have an effect and have imply some variation on the probability of me participating in collective actions, but this is not stable, it's not robust, it's not significant. Instead, the ideas that I attribute to others, that has a very statistically significant effect on my future behavior. So we found uh, longitudinal evidence for people attributing more conservative ideas to others, deterring them from participating in the future in collective actions, which is extremely exciting for us. And that was the third section.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, not so far. Might have some questions at the end, probably. So, Chris, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for staying with us. Let me share. Are you sharing the slides, Ismael?
I think
No,
it's better if you do. Yeah.
I can share it. Yeah, no worries. Um, mm, So basically, from what we have shown you, we've been trying to think about how to move this on with new methodological approaches that can bridge one important challenge. So, as we have discussed, identifying egos ideas is hard, but survey research has been quite keen and advanced to found different methods to identify egos idea. But then identifying alters perceived ideology is even harder. And we have developed one way of doing this with the factorial survey experiment, as Ismael just described. Um, and also with this, and in that sense, it's a really suitable approach because we have this mirror design for egos and alters perceived ideology. We have a stronger causal identification strategy, but of course, this comes with limitations in terms of how we measure ideological preferences is of course constrained by survey instruments, which is ideology might be much wider or much more general than what we specifically measure with our instruments. So to some extent, this is a limitation. And of course, the challenge of how to generalize our populations and settings. Both of our designs, the one in 2018 and the one in 2022, are quite specific to social conflicts that apply to the Chilean context at those points, right? So, of course, we would like to develop something that's widely applicable. Um, we think that complementary designs could bridge these validity limitations, and basically, we have been discussing these new approaches to team in terms of thinking what other designs could evidence ideological inversion. So first, the idea of how can we identify non-constrained ideological views in natural speech, how people naturally speak and make sense of the world in terms of in terms of ideological differences, and also designs that could be portable to different settings and ideally comparable to different settings. So we identify two important opportunities for doing so, which is on the first hand, the idea that now we have social media data widely available in many contexts, and its use is not only wide but even increasing. And the fact that we have natural language processing, important advances in NLP within the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a huge increase in the uh, capabilities and techniques to deal with natural language in social research. So the question is, could we identify the key elements for ideological inversion with social media data and natural language processing? We think that there are promising new pathways in this in this sense. And here we just want to briefly discuss a new tentative approach for doing so. So basically, it's quite straightforward to think how we can measure egos ideology with social media data, and we have many good examples already existing about how we can actually derive the ideological positions and stances of individuals from social media data. One of the benefits is, of course, having no topic constraints, observing something closer to the natural everyday language of people, non-constrained, not constrained by survey instruments, and also a type of data that, as I mentioned, is present in all type of setting, not just in Chile, not just in a particular time, but in multiple, in probably almost all of the type of settings we can think in contemporary world, at least. The issue is similar to what we did with the panel design, is that others perceive ideology can only be inferred, and we cannot. It's really hard to think about how to really grasp people's ideas about others' ideology, right? But we can, by using social media data, we can get the ideological attributions to groups, and also, very importantly, we can track these attributions over time. And for that, one approach we are working on is using structural topic models, which is a rather established, not so new maybe, but rather established natural language processing technique to make sense of latent constructs in natural language, like social media data, to where we can identify emerging ideological positions, which is different to what we've done in the past, and we can check their relative importance over time. We can exploit the temporal structure that we usually have in social media data to understand how these latent constructs, these topic models, are usually called. Develop over time. And a very simple example, and this is only dummy data, just to illustrate this point, is we can think that these blue points, these blue crosses, are represent hundreds, thousands, or even millions of social media posts that describe everyday language of people, things that people are voicing in social media. And the topic models describe latent constructs that relate to this post. In this case, we have two topics that we would label as high cost grievances, basically grievances about the rising cost of everyday life, inflation, like it's something that we can see in many contexts, especially since the pandemic. And then a second topic, which has a lot to do with making attributions to groups, right? In this case, we label the second topic conformist citizens. And basically, we have messages or posts that where people complain about how dormant or how conformist people are, or citizens, or general labels that we can track with these topics. And then we have like two topics. One is about something closer to an ideological position of ego. And then we have an ideological attribution to a group, which is a generic group like citizens, the people, and so on. So with structural topic models, we can, for example, in a simple structure of 3 time points, we could follow the relative prevalence of these topics, see that they're like rather equally present at T1, but then they both increase at T2 and T3. But basically, the topic 2, which is the attribution to a group, increases at a faster rate. Therefore, people are tending to think that it's more important in the natural language sphere of this fictitious social media data. It starts to gain traction, the idea in the popular discourse, the idea that people are conformist, while the grievances tend to keep a similar level. Then we could, for example, use the difference of the prevalence in the two topics. Let's say topic 2, the prevalence of topic 2 minus the prevalence of topic 1 at T1. And we could use that as a proxy of ideological inversion to predict in this sort of cross-lag model, panel model, how this difference in the two prevalences predicts or influence protest behavior or protest participation in second time, and so on. And we can, of course, control by the baseline levels of protests and also the previous levels of diff. Um, if this would be a full cross-lag panel model, we would, of course, have autoregressive vectors, but this is not a main point here. And this is something that we think could advance identifying a geological inversion in different settings with a unconstrained way of understanding how people make sense of society directly from their posts in a social media, rather than constrained by our survey instruments. And Ismael, would you like to wrap up?
You're on mute, Ismail.
Okay, now I can wrap up. Well, thank you, Cristobal. So basically, we have been trying to explain the idea of ideological inversion as a mechanism for the legitimation of social order, in which it is not that individuals their own on themselves, believe an order or relation of elimination or structure is fair or just, but rather that they perceive the others to be judging it as fair because of their practices. So it is an inversion of the relationship between material praxis, which is constrained materially, and the ideas. No, so material society appears as the result of ideas when it's the other way around, basically. From this perspective, we have shown that basically to measure this, we need methods enabling us to measure how actors see each other. So we need to work with dyads or with relational data rather than individual data, which is on itself a challenge for most of the methods of the social sciences. And we have also shown that we need comparison either across time or across contexts in order to assess the most important causal effects which are here involved. This can be done with panel data on one side. It can be done with experimental data like in factual surveys as a way of assessing relational characteristics, attributions, but it might also be possible to do with at the aggregated level with registered data from social media, and we hope to find further avenues for, taking advantage of this huge amount of information which is already there. And we will be very happy to hear about people interested in dealing with a subject like this using this sort of methodology.
Thank you so much. So we did have a question earlier. Sorry, Evelyn. I did respond, but I'm not sure if you saw. The question was, in the last result that you presented, Ismail, it wasn't clear whether the alter idea, ideological bias, was inducing more collective action.
Sorry?
It wasn't, so the question is, in the last result, it wasn't clear whether alter idea, so ideological bias, induced more collective action.
Okay. Yeah, in the panel data, yeah, what we found is that because in our measurements, higher values always imply more progressive ideas. So lower values are more conservative ideas. So when the bias is higher, it means that you think the others are not as conservative and they are more progressive. And this has a direct effect on the probability of collective action. So basically, the more I think the other people are conservative, the less likely it is that in 2 months after, I have been involved in collective actions. That's what we found. Instead, my own ideas do not have a robust effect on my future behavior.
Thank you. All right, so that's it for the presentation. We have some time now for questions. Just let me know if you would like to go on screen to ask your question. Also, feel free to ask your question on the chat. Okay, so a comment from Agnieszka. Are you aware of research by Mirta Galisic? She has been studying the impact of alter belief perception on attitude change using network models and experiments. I will, this is from the SFI, of course. I will copy this link and put it in the chat for you. Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't aware.
Excellent. Thank you, Agnieszka.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. In terms of the the notion of comparing across contexts, right? So, do you think that using unstructured data gets around the issue of
Mm.
the the lack of generalizability of using that one scale? Is there a way to sort of standardize how we're using that unstructured data across contexts to see um, perhaps not just what's happening in terms of the ideological legitimation or ideological inversion process at the individual level, but to see precisely, that question that you had about, is it something about the neoliberalization of the market? Is it something maybe perhaps about the level of standing inequality? Is it something about the quality of the political system? Is it maybe worse in places with a history of authoritarianism or in places where there's a history of colonialism? Um, do you have any thoughts on sort of that higher level of
Mhm.
prediction?
Okay, I'll go with that. I think that with the unstructured data, social media data, or even any other large enough corpus of text data, what you can build is basically comparable scores, relative scores of just different topics, um, which of course you will need to calibrate them. No, so you basically you should model all the corpus together, I guess, and in the end observe differences between the relative size of topics in each context. No, and then on the other side, of course, you would have to collect data to represent these structural macro level variables that you are talking about, which of course will be the most important part in the sense of the explanatory factors for the behavior of this course. No, so I don't think that the text data itself should be used to model both explanatory and unexplained variables, but you can create these explained variables and then use other systematic data and macro level variables to explain this course. In that sense, I think it could fill a gap, an important gap, in making possible uh, abundant comparisons across time as well. Yeah, across, I mean, and space and time, no? Context and time.
Hmm,
Yeah.
I would like
interesting.
to add something to that because I think like the discussion reminds me a lot about what happens in survey research with measurement invariance, right? It's usually a big challenge to do a proper cross-country comparison or cross-context comparison in general. And what usually happens in measurement invariance is that you find that multiple constructs that are widely used and compared are seldomly really invariant, right? In this case, with unstructured data, if you rely on this machine learning techniques such as structural topic models, of course, that one of the issues you have is that you're dealing with topics that are emergent, right? It's unlikely that you will find exactly the same topic in another context. The question is, which assumptions can we make to basically compare similar topics as strong ideological stances that exist in different contexts, and of course you wouldn't expect them to be exactly the same ones if you follow the literatures on varieties of capitalism, of like contemporary neoliberalism, and so on. It's the conflicts tend to be very context specific, but I think like one of the challenges is try to achieve a more standardized score. But at the end of the day, you will always deal with this issue that you have to make an assumption about how relevant this ideological, for example, topic model is in the context, and make sense of their effects in two different countries. So I think it's like not impossible, but of course it comes with non-minor challenges and necessary assumptions.
Interesting. In terms of the the anchors that you were using, and so if you had stability, authority, change, and participation, those to me sound very much in the political domain, and in some cases, well, in most cases, I agree, and also the choice of class as the variant. Those are, fairly widespread and might, generalize to a lot of contexts. But in some contexts, maybe other sort of anchors or other sort of dimensions might be um, more salient. I'm wondering if you've thought of sort of delving a little bit into um, sort of the political science indexing research that looks into sort of what are the major cleavages in this context versus that context. What are the sort of major tensions that people have in the political domain? So, in one context, it might be about race, and in another context, it might be about gender identity. In another context, it might be about an intersection of race and class. Do you think that in certain circumstances you could find the same kind of overestimated bias in the other direction? I'm thinking like where sort of perhaps a progressive position on a particular topic is sort of dominant, and people overestimate that because of that dominance structurally, let's say.
Cool. Very important question. Yeah, we engage in different dimensions in the Chilean case as well. We have measured this for this uh, for this political social change dimension, also for state control corporations and taxing and education models, market versus public, healthcare models, gender relations, family models, and several other topics. We always find this gap. We always find that the status quo pole is overestimated over the
Mm-hmm.
change pole. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that so far that's been stable in all the dimensions we have tested. Of course, you can never test an absolute. I mean, but so far it's always the case. Now we we stay with this political dimension because of course the perception of the others desiring concretely social change, political change, it's a much closer proxy to explain collective action. So it's a it so we observe the gap always, but this is the dimension that best predicts behavior in the following. No, we tend to believe. I mean, I think it's a very overarching mechanism that actually explains, and this it's the same explanation for all these biases in different ways, but the way it gets closer to explaining the behavior, the future behavior of people, I think it's easier to grasp when you talk about whether you believe that the others want change or not in the most direct way. No, so I think you should find the bias in almost every situation, but this dimension is relevant because it mentions the desire for change concretely. No, of course you could make variations of this. No, so for example, you could, I don't know, create a dimension where you think whether you think that, I don't know, racism needs to be abolished in my society, for example. No, so but it needs to have a desire for social change very clearly specified in the scale if you want to relate it to collective action, I think. No,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and and it's important to know that these dimensions came very specifically from the Chilean context in which we were working. So it is no coincidence that this dimension between more participation and more democratization was designed, and then just after we had this huge debate about the constitutional reform and the norms of democratic governments, etc. Of course, in other contexts, the main dimension related to social change might be different. I agree completely. Yeah.
Interesting. Does anybody have any other questions? All right, doesn't seem to be the case. I would just mention one last thing. In it, the I wonder if you also have some kind of cohort effect in this data, where, you know, you have certain historical periods where things aren't really changing, and then there's a reason for that, and it might be partially because of this ideological inversion, where that overestimation is part of what's going on in that sort of what the social movement theorists call abeyance, or um, what De La Sobronier called inertia. But in certain circumstances, and I think some people have written about, dramatic social change or normative influence, things change in a nonlinear way. You get tipping points, and then things change very dramatically and very quickly, like you were saying, happened in Chile. And perhaps maybe if you had data a little bit earlier, you might have seen something different, in terms of that overestimation, given the relationship um, that you showed between that bias and collective action.
Yeah.
So how do you model those kinds of nonlinearities using these sort of approaches, whether the factorial or the unstructured? Do you think?
I mean, for starters, I think you can model the 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 likely it is for specific people with different perceptions uh, to engage in collective action, but it's really difficult to engage actual collective action events, in any linear or nonlinear way. Um, if you take seriously this idea that actually there is no real consensus, and what you need is it's the very collective action to show there is a gap, in a way. What you end up with is the idea that it is probably very contingent situations, very contingent crises that open the political opportunity for a sudden, a bridge between the actual ideas and the perceived ideas. And I don't think you can really model that in a very systematic way, to be completely honest. I don't know. In the Chilean case, I think it had to do a lot to do with, you know, there was just no public transport that day, and that was it in a way, you know. So I don't think we will ever be able to do that sort of thing. Of course, you can approach certain demographics tendencies, but in very long terms, not in actual events. Now, regarding cohort effects, we saw some differences which are important in both directions, and it's very interesting. So it's difficult, of course, because it's cross-sectional data, so we cannot separate cohort effect from age effects. No, but for instance, older people or the cohorts, tended to overestimate more conservatism regarding the political dimension, and younger people tended to overestimate more conservatism regarding the economic dimension. So, and I tended to interpret this more in terms of age, in the sense of the economic part, in the sense of the experience of managing, a household and a budget within capitalism, and how it disciplines you. So you are more able to understand how the others behave as you get older economically. And instead, in terms of cohort, perhaps with experience with democratic elections and democratic systems in different cohorts in Chile, the contrary, no? But yeah, you will need to have continuous data to separate that, I think. But I think there are, some serious seriously interesting dynamics that you can explore.
Thank you so much. So everybody, and thank you again. Our next session will be a hybrid 2-day workshop by Professor Simon Angus on using natural language analysis and processing to examine public discourse change and stability. So this might be relevant and interesting for all of us as well. I'll put the links in the chat now, and I hope to see you again in our future sessions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very
day.
much. Up to. Okay, Fouad. Have a great day.
Bye.
Many thanks again for the invitation. It was really cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really interesting. Bye.